think I don't have, yeah. Thank you so much, Christophe. I think you did very well. You just kept the delay. You didn't increase it, so great. And thank you to all our panelists. Yeah, I mean, I think what you said about the fight against, clearly about misinformation and disinformation, from what we heard, we understand this is a very complex issue, and that there are large gaps still in understanding the phenomena at stake. So it's obviously difficult to address those issues, and more research are needed. But on the other hand, we also heard a call for more holistic and more systemic approach to this issue. So thank you so much for your for this debate that I think paves the way for further discussions. This is a very hard topic that I'm sure our friends in the Governance Directorate at the OECD will continue looking into. So, without going to a coffee break, let's now move on to the next panel, which to some extent, is not unrelated, which is about countering undue influence in democracies and reinforcing integrity. This is our last panel before lunch, but we'll try to make sure that you do have time for lunch and for interactions. We'll probably postpone a little bit the start of the afternoon sessions, not too much though. And so we will then move into smaller breakout sessions in the afternoon. So one of the key messages of the Trust Survey is that is about expectations on governance integrity. And we see that those have changed over time, and that it's not, the results show that are not as good as might have been expected. So this is really a critical issue for trust. Because integrity is, of course, an inherent value of our democracies that ensure that governments respond to citizen needs and are not influenced by the interests of particular interests or constituencies, and also, of course, by undue influence of foreign actors. So this is a very key issue in today's time, and I'm very pleased that we now have a panel on this discussion, and I'm happy to ask the panelists and the moderator to come to the on stage, and I'm going to hand over to Giulio Basio, who is the head of public sector integrity at the OECD, to lead this panel. I'm going to ask you to really keep to the time, so we have time for lunch afterwards. Thank you, Giulio.
Somebody left this. Thank you very much, Martin. Welcome everybody to the third plenary session on reinforcing integrity and countering undue influence in democracies. Apologies for the delay. I think the interesting discussions have taken us, I think, a half hour late, but don't worry. I think we can have an interesting discussion. We'll go a little bit into the lunch break, but then we will extend the lunch break, and we will start a little bit later in the afternoon sessions. If you're here, I think you will all agree that integrity is an inherent value of democracy that ensures that the government responds to the interests of the people. We also now know that integrity systems also help to strengthen the resilience of democracies to foreign interference by non-democracies. So the discussion today aims at unpacking some of the elements around these two issues of integrity, what it means, how we can strengthen it, what are the challenges that we're facing today, and how particularly the issues of undue influence are affecting democracies, and now with the added element, if I can say, of foreign influence. For the discussion today, we have actually a very distinguished group of panelists. I will actually not introduce them myself. I would like to ask them if in 1 minute or less you can introduce yourselves, but especially also say, why are you here? Why do you accept this invitation? Why is this issue important to you? and some of you coming from very far. Maybe if you allow me, we go in this order. Delia, please.
I am Delia Ferreira Rubio. I am the chair of Transparency International, the leading anti-corruption organization. We are present in more than 100 countries around the world. Why I accept the very kind invitation, and I have had the pleasure to be working on undue influence and integrity with the OECD in many occasions. Why? Because integrity is key for democracy. It is key if we want to restore trust. And also, it is key if we want to prevent and tackle corruption and undue influence. Without integrity, it will be impossible.
Thank you, Delia. Kristen.
Hello, yes. Good morning. My name is Kristen Sample, and I'm the Director of Governance at the National Democratic Institute, which is a non-governmental, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that supports democratic processes and partners around the world. So why am I here? Well, you had me at democracy. Just seeing the title and the concept of this conference I thought was so important. The OECD has a policy-focused mandate, and I'm very impressed that the OECD is not taking a technocratic approach to its mandate, but rather being very democracy-aware and democracy-intentional, so that its policy and its programs are reinforcing democratic processes and institutions. So props to the OECD and to this process that you have underway.
Thank you. Hannah.
Good morning. My name is Hannah Cameron. I'm from Wellington, New Zealand, and I'm the Deputy Commissioner at Te Kaumataho, the Public Service Commission. I guess I'm here. In New Zealand, we have our own public trust survey, and when we ask people why they trust, those that answer positively, they talk about responsiveness and reliability, but they also talk about the people that they interact with. And they use words like respectful and honest. And I really feel that that's what integrity means to me. And I think this panel is critical to trust. It's about how our public service can deliver services and have those interactions in a way that citizens really believe that we have their best interests at heart, which is obviously the underpinning of all of our institutions.
Thank you. Migaud.
Je suis Didier Migaud, président de la Haute Autorité pour la transparence de la vie publique en France. Et pourquoi je suis ici? Parce que le sujet correspond aux missions qui sont les nôtres, parce que la question de l'intégrité, de l'honnêteté, de la probité, comme l'a dit la présidente de Transparency International, sont des sujets essentiels pour nos démocraties. On voit les efforts qui sont faits pour déstabiliser justement les démocraties, et l'exemplarité, l'intégrité, l'honnêteté des responsables publics, tout ceci sont une préoccupation première de nos concitoyens. C'est le cas en tout cas en France, où la crise de confiance est aussi très forte, d'où la nécessité de convaincre les citoyens qu'il y a un certain nombre d'institutions qui sont là pour contrôler et pour assurer la transparence nécessaire. Je pense qu'on aura l'occasion d'y revenir.
Merci.
My name is Jack Markell. I'm the U.S. ambassador to the OECD. And I was particularly interested in this invitation because this topic is just so foundational to who we are, certainly in the United States and in all of our like-minded countries. As you all know, we had a very important election last week, and in advance of that election, President Biden gave a very powerful speech, essentially focusing on the urgency of standing up for and fighting for our democracy. And he said each generation has to defend, protect, and to preserve and to choose it. For that's what democracy is, a choice of, by, and for the people. And that is as true today as it has ever been in our history, and I think all of the issues that are on the table over these couple days are just so important as we work against some of the other forces out there at the moment. But very glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Muy buenos días, mi nombre es Natalia Díaz, soy ministra de la Presidencia de Costa Rica. Para mí es un honor participar en este foro porque obviamente, como muchos de ustedes saben, somos uno de los 10 países que tienen las democracias más sólidas en el mundo, pero eso no quiere decir que estemos exentos de posibles amenazas o riesgos a este sistema. Pienso que podemos aprender todos de esta experiencia, podemos además compartir las mejores prácticas y realmente me siento muy honrada de poder participar con ustedes este día. Gracias.
Thank you very much to all of you for taking the time for being with us today. Dick, if I can start with you. I mean, in this round, what we'd like to cover is focus very much on the integrity of those that represent us. What are the issues, what are the challenges that we see today, perhaps even compared to the past, and how we can finally achieve what we call political integrity, the integrity of the elected officials, of the appointed officials. So if you could tell us about why you think it's so essential, what are these challenges that you see, and what can governments finally do?
Okay, a long question for almost a panel, a complete conference. But some results on the survey are very important in this aspect, because only 40% of the respondents says that public officials would refuse a bribe. And we are talking of very established, well-developed democracies. And the majority says that public servants would accept a job in private sector in exchange of a favor. And this is really very, very striking, not because it is new for those of us who are working in anti-corruption, but really striking in this kind of survey in very solid or apparently robust democracies. Because what they are saying is that elected officials are not seen as working for the public good, as you said at the beginning. And all the problems that are detailed or pictured in the survey has to do with the big elephant in the room, which is money and politics. The very dangerous relation of money and politics. I am not just talking about political finance or campaign finance. I am talking about public procurement, conflicts of interest, the revolving doors, and this is crucial for democracy. The questions that we are asking is, are the representatives representing us or representing those who financed their campaigns or their career as politicians, or are really ready to offer a private job in exchange of a favor? And a favor is not a favor, it's a public policy decision. We have to be very careful about that. So who are the representatives really representing? Second, are we really equal in democracy in the face of this dangerous relation of money and politics? I don't think that any ordinary citizen in many countries, and let's move to the global sphere, can be sure of an answer from a politician, a deputy or a senator, if he or she makes a call, vis-a-vis a call from those financing the campaigns or giving money or being able to offer the job. Is democracy inclusive in this panorama? I have really my doubts. And it is not only efficiency. Efficiency is very important, as you, Minister, said. But it is also coherence and exemplarity. What we saw during COVID was not only public procurement full of scandals on corruption, vis-a-vis vaccines, ventilators, and all that. We also see public officials, elected officials, acting without any exemplarity, acting without integrity, not complying with the rules that they themselves had imposed on the rest of the citizens. We see the Partygate scandals not only in one country, around the world. We saw the vaccine gates with the VIP vaccination in many countries with different kind of privilege. So that is what we are talking about. And when we talk about integrity, we are talking about the quality of public policies. Are policies oriented to public good, or are policies the response and the payment of favors already received? That's what we are talking about. What we need more information, more integrity, less impunity. So the idea of consequences for corrupt behavior is not strong enough. Less impunity and less indifference, less tolerance on the part of the citizens. Don't abandon the fight. We have to keep on asking and pressing for integrity.
Thank you very much, Delia. I think you are very much outlining at a global scale the challenges that many countries face, and also what is feeding this discontent in certain places, discontent with democracy. If I can turn to you, Minister Díaz, Costa Rica es la democracia más antigua de América Latina. ¿Cómo ha ayudado la integridad política a Costa Rica a mantener esta fuerte democracia y dónde continúan existiendo los desafíos?
Sí, muchas gracias por su consulta. Efectivamente, desde que nosotros promulgamos nuestra Constitución Política en el año de 1949, nuestro sistema democrático se ha visto fortalecido por varias razones importantes. Podríamos decir que una de ellas tiene que ver con la educación cívica de aquel momento, que es muy distinta a la actual, y también el modelo de solidaridad social que se implementaba en el país en aquel momento, donde existía una movilidad social real, donde las personas tenían oportunidades de salir adelante independientemente de dónde crecieran. Y eso se ha venido perdiendo poco a poco. La tenemos, pero no como estuvo en el pasado. Entonces, ese es uno de los retos más importantes que estamos enfrentando en este momento, y ese debilitamiento hasta cierto punto de la clase media costarricense. Eso ha venido disminuyéndose y ha sido un pilar fundamental del por qué la integridad también ha contribuido al tema de democracia, y no en vano estos han sido temas relevantes para considerar a nuestra nación como un país de democracia plena. Ese es uno de los puntos más relevantes. Tengo que hacer también mención de que en nuestra Constitución Política tenemos regulada una autoridad electoral desde el año 1949 también, que es el Tribunal Supremo de Elecciones, que es una instancia completamente independiente, que tiene gran credibilidad a nivel del país e internacionalmente, y también la abolición del ejército, que a partir de ese año de 1949 en Costa Rica no existe, y eso ha permitido destinar gran parte de esos dineros a la inversión social. Sin embargo, como les dije anteriormente, esto quiere decir que estamos enfrentando en este momento retos muy importantes y amenazas a esa democracia, por la falta también de oportunidades para toda la población por igual. Existen, pero hay un reto enorme en ese sentido, y yo sí quisiera destacar aquí algunos de los puntos que considero relevantes en ese aspecto, y el primero de ellos tiene que ver con lo que mencioné al inicio, que es la educación. Y en la educación cívica, entendida esta como la formación íntegra del ciudadano. No es simplemente ir a un curso y aprender, sino internalizar que tengo que ser una persona que tome decisiones por mi país, que me sienta identificado a participar de los procesos políticos, que realmente me motive a dar la milla extra para salir adelante y ayudar al país a surgir, y eso se ha venido perdiendo. Los principios, los valores, esas enseñanzas desde el hogar se han venido también perdiendo a lo interno en el país, y pienso que tenemos un reto importante en ese sentido para que las personas puedan involucrarse y tener la formación para un contexto global, donde puedan también defenderse, donde haya educación también del inglés como tiene que ser, Si bien es cierto, una gran parte de la población habla inglés, esa es una de las oportunidades que nosotros también necesitamos impulsar a lo interno del país para que tengamos ciudadanos de mundo. Ese es uno de los retos principales. Tenemos también que mejorar, en los procesos de rendición de cuentas y en aquellos que promuevan la participación de la ciudadanía directamente en todo el proceso de toma de decisiones. Ahí tenemos un reto importantísimo, que si bien es cierto es una democracia ya, tenemos que crear esos mecanismos para que haya más representación. Luego también hay un reto enorme en materia de integridad pública y es cómo podemos institucionalizar lo que hoy ya existe a nivel de un organismo de coordinación. Ese es otro de los retos importantes donde podemos involucrar a todas las instituciones competentes. Hay un esfuerzo que está haciendo el gobierno y que se ha venido también impulsando, que es muy importante y tiene que ver con el combate a la corrupción, que es básicamente la eliminación de los trámites y requisitos innecesarios o excesivos para generar emprendimientos, para generar oportunidades en el país, que se ha vuelto pues una maraña muy compleja y que obstaculiza también, y lo que hace es que abra el portillo para que se puedan dar actos de corrupción con funcionarios públicos y empresas del sector privado eventualmente interesados en que salgan los permisos a tiempo. Y eso ha sido uno de los retos más importantes en los que nos encontramos el día de hoy. Y finalmente, para no alargar mucho mi intervención, el fortalecimiento de las capacidades de los órganos encargados de la investigación de los actos de corrupción, en especial aquellos asuntos complejos y los que están relacionados con la criminalidad transnacional de alto nivel político o económico. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Minister. I mean, you've outlined, I would say, quite a long list of actions that could be taken. Allow me just to highlight two, perhaps. One is the issue of values that we had discussed even earlier, which was values that they are still in society, but perhaps we could do more, especially coming from the government, re-establishing within schools and curriculums civic education systems or social solidarity as they existed in many countries in the past. And, as you said, more representation and better representation. If we move now to M. Migaud, la haute autorité, après une décennie d'expérience dans la promotion de la transparence, mais quels sont les défis que vous continuez à rencontrer dans la mise en place et le renforcement des normes d'intégrité? Et quels sont les outils essentiels pour relever ces défis?
Alors effectivement, depuis un certain nombre d'années, en France, un certain nombre d'outils ont été mis en place, dont notamment la Haute Autorité pour la transparence de la vie publique, qui est une autorité totalement indépendante des pouvoirs publics et qui décide à partir d'une collégialité. Indépendance, collégialité, je pense que c'est extrêmement important de marquer une distance vis-à-vis, bien sûr, des pouvoirs publics, et puis de pouvoir compter sur un collège avec des personnalités qui peuvent avoir des regards différents, et c'est le cas pour la Haute Autorité française, à partir du moment où vous avez des membres du Conseil d'État, de la Cour de cassation, de la Cour des comptes, et puis un certain nombre de personnalités qui peuvent être représentatives aussi d'un certain nombre de secteurs. Nous avons des outils aussi, les déclarations de patrimoine qui permettent d'apprécier si un responsable public s'est enrichi de façon indue. Nous avons l'outil des déclarations d'intérêt, comme dans beaucoup de pays. C'est un outil essentiel pour prévenir les conflits d'intérêts. Et au-delà des rubriques que l'on peut avoir sur une déclaration d'intérêt, ça doit être l'occasion pour le responsable public de réfléchir à tout ce qui est susceptible de le mettre en situation de conflit d'intérêts. Lui-même, compte tenu de ses activités passées, en voyant aussi la situation de son conjoint, voire au-delà d'un certain nombre de personnes proches de lui-même, soit au niveau familial, soit au niveau d'un cercle d'amis. Et en ce qui nous concerne, nous passons beaucoup de temps, justement, pour, à partir de la déclaration d'intérêt, nous efforcer de prévenir, d'accompagner les responsables publics pour éviter qu'ils se mettent en situation de prise illégale d'intérêt. La prévention du conflit d'intérêts est vraiment notre fil rouge. Alors, il y a ce contrôle qui est essentiel. Vous avez aussi la transparence qui est bien sûr indispensable, c'est-à-dire la publicité, la publication, alors qui peut être variée selon la qualité de la personne et selon le fait qu'elle soit élue ou non élue. Mais la transparence est essentielle. Le contrôle ne suffit pas, parce que la transparence, elle permet le regard du citoyen et le regard des médias. Et ce regard peut conduire à des signalements et qui nous conduisent, à partir du moment où ce qui nous est apporté nous apparaît suffisamment sérieux, à réouvrir des dossiers et à prendre un certain nombre de décisions. Dernier point qui me paraît essentiel et sans lequel la confiance des citoyens ne peut pas être non plus totale, c'est la sanction. À partir du moment où il y a eu des comportements déviants, s'il n'y a pas de sanction, ou si la sanction intervient beaucoup trop tardivement, eh bien, ce sont des motifs de défiance du citoyen. Le citoyen, lui, quand il commet une contravention, quand il commet un délit, il est souvent immédiatement sanctionné par une amende. Bon, et puis il y a des procédures qui sont en cours. Il faut aussi que l'élu qui ne respecte pas, par exemple, ses obligations déclaratives, il puisse être sanctionné sans délai, à partir du moment où, bien sûr, il a été relancé, voire même a reçu des injonctions. Voilà, donc nous avons un cadre. Alors, nous formulons un certain nombre de propositions auprès des pouvoirs publics pour qu'on puisse renforcer ici et là dans le nombre de personnes concernées par ces déclarations de patrimoine et d'intérêt, et puis également sur le droit de communication que nous pouvons avoir. C'est essentiel aussi pour que nous puissions, je dirais, faire des contrôles effectifs, et puis bien évidemment le pouvoir de sanction qui est fondamental. Puis j'aurai l'occasion, mais tout à l'heure, de revenir sur le contrôle des mobilités privées, publiques. Là aussi, c'est un sujet essentiel.
Thank you very much. I think, Delia, you will be happy to hear this, because we were talking about impunity, which remains a challenge in many places, and we were discussing also earlier about the challenge that sometimes the systems are there and prevention is there, but then the last part, or the other side of the coin, is still pending or missing. And something else that Mr. Migo has mentioned, which is that the control is not enough. And I'm very happy to hear that, because a lot of the work that we do at the OECD goes much beyond just the control. And you provided some of the, what I would say, keys for success. Of course, transparency, but even other aspects of the independence, collegiality, and providing the tools to support the public officials to take the right decision. If I can turn now to you, Ambassador Markel, what has been the United States' approach to strengthening political integrity, especially in the context of the new anti-corruption strategy that was adopted in December, so it's fairly recent, which actually applies this strategy both at home but also abroad?
So we start this conversation with the view that the strength of any democracy is dependent upon the belief, the trust that people have that their voice can actually matter, that their voice does matter on issues that affect their lives. And I think about what my colleague here from Costa Rica said in her comments about the threats that are posed to many of the middle class, members of the middle class in our countries, as they believe they have fewer opportunities to advance. Mm-hmm. She's right, and there are many reasons for that. But one of the ones that we cannot ignore is the fact that political corruption itself can rob citizens of access to important services, whether it's healthcare or public safety, education, and the like. It harms the business environment, it decreases economic opportunity, it exacerbates inequality. And so given all these downsides, the Biden administration, as Julio mentioned, created the first ever U.S. strategy on countering corruption, which does set out a plan to organize the fight against corruption both in the U.S. and abroad. In the US, it means addressing some of the gaps in our anti-money laundering regime, like collecting information on shell companies, as well as, for that matter, on real estate, so that ill-gotten gains are not parked into investment properties, which of course can distort our housing markets. It means taking a hard look at how digital assets may be used to further corruption. We're holding corrupt actors accountable by prosecuting them, by freezing assets, by recovering assets, and then returning the assets to those people who were harmed by the corruption in the first place. Internationally, we're working to strengthen multilateral anti-corruption infrastructure at places like the OECD, as well as the UN and the Organization of American States as well. We also recognize that private sector actors have a very important role to play here, not just governments, as it relates to fighting corruption. Civil society is really important, as is investigative journalism. Now, this is really quite core to our history with the focus on a free press, which I can tell you can sometimes be uncomfortable for those in power, but incredibly important. And so Thomas Jefferson, when he was, our third president, said if he had to choose between a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, he would, without any hesitation, choose newspapers without a government, because he believed that the role of the press is so, in terms of keeping government power in check, is so fundamental to a healthy society. We hope that's not a choice we have to make, but that is where that's where he came out on it. So to this end, we're thinking even differently about some of our foreign assistance funding. In addition to the traditional humanitarian assistance, we're also expanding and leveraging public-private partnerships to root out corruption, to enhance information sharing, and to promote best practices as well.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Actually, if I can add to or complement to what you just said about the strategy and share here with the audience, we actually recently analyzed the US anti-corruption strategy through the OECD public integrity indicators, and we actually found that the scope of coverage is among the widest and deepest in the world. And actually, perhaps the anti-corruption strategy that connects the most to the issues of democracy that we're discussing today. So that including issues of what you just outlined, media, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, financial integrity, et cetera, et cetera. So what I invite you to look at this strategy, which is very, very connected to many of the elements that we will be discussing throughout the day today. Hannah, if we move now to New Zealand. So as we have discussed, elected and appointed officials need to uphold public integrity standards. This is what we've mentioned. Yet, the integrity of public servants of the civil service is, of course, inherently connected to democracy. How can then we ensure that these standards of integrity are upheld by public servants? And how can such standards contribute to an effective working relationship between the civil service and the political leaders?
So the name of my organization I mentioned before is Te Kaumatahu, the Public Service Commission. Te Kaumatahu, that's not a direct translation. It comes from Maori tradition, and it conjures the place where people stand and being an authority for preserving kawa, which are broadly protocols, procedures, the frameworks that guide and support us. And when we were presented with that name, Maori leaders talked to us about a flock of birds and how a leader in a flock might fly sometimes at the front, sometimes on the wing, sometimes at the rear, to keep the flock in formation. And I think that's the concept that we bring to the concept of how we preserve integrity. We see it as first and foremost about people and about culture, about flying in formation, and a shared understanding about what's important. And we talk a lot in New Zealand about the concept of the spirit of service that public servants bring to their roles. People choose careers in public service because they want to serve their communities. And we firmly believe that if we put this at the center of interactions with citizens, then that will in itself bring the integrity and the principles that citizens are seeking. So government organizations don't need to somehow inject some kind of values into those people or to ensure that they comply with rules and regulations. We flip that on its head and say, well, it's more about that those leaders have a duty to preserve and nurture that intrinsic motivation and to protect the power of public service and of government. And in our recent reforms in New Zealand, we actually made that explicit in our legislation. There is a duty on leaders to preserve, protect, and nurture the spirit of service that people bring to their role. And we also included in our legislation other fundamental principles that had existed in convention, things like political neutrality and free and frank advice. And these are the principles that really ensure that the public service provides that best possible advice, and that once decisions have been made, that they implement them to the best of their abilities. And in our legislation, the chief executives, the secretaries within our agencies are responsible for preserving those principles. And they're responsible to that, not to the government of the day, but to the apolitical public service commissioner. And we did this not because we thought our public service was broken. In fact, we have very high levels of trust and well-flourishing democracy in many ways, but because, as many people have already said today, you can't take these things for granted. And we were very cautious to ensure that these principles are not eroded into the future. And we think that by putting these things in legislation, it increases a confidence of public servants and of ministers and elected officials. It creates a common understanding about the parameters of how those relationships should be conducted. And we believe that that will enable them to fly in formation and to get on with the important work that they have to do to tackle complex problems and to govern nations.
Thank you, Hannah, for this. And also, if you allow us, we may borrow from you the flock of birds. I think it's very nice to explain a lot of the work that we do and what we mean when we're talking about public integrity. And one aspect that you're highlighting that I like to highlight from what you said is this issue of intrinsic motivation in public service. Many times we forget that most people that join public service and are serving the public today have this intrinsic motivation. So it's about nurturing, and this is also connected to public integrity. So to finish this first round, Kristen, if we can, perhaps with you, I'd like to focus on a particular actor, which is the one that aggregates interests when we're talking about representative democracies, and these are political parties, which are, of course, essential for integrity, but they are often overlooked when we speak about core integrity actors. What role do you think political parties can play in promoting integrity, and what can governments do to support better political parties in strengthening integrity?
Great, thanks so much, Julio, for that question. I want to start out by saying that this is not a new problem. It's a very old problem. It's a problem with no easy answers, and people like Delia precisely have been looking at this and exploring it and kind of ringing the alarm bell in terms of the challenges and the dangers of political finance corruption for many years. So your question, do political parties have a role to play? They absolutely do. I think for too long, parties have been seen as the problem rather than part of the solution. I think it's really important to flip that script and look for ways that parties can, again, do more when it comes to political finance integrity. Along those lines, I was asked to speak specifically on, NDI has a program called Win with Integrity that focuses on those political parties who want to go above and beyond the legislation, who want to show that they are actors with integrity, who want to clean their own house as well so that they're not vulnerable to different forms of corruption and misuse. So again, political parties don't need to wait for legislation. There are internal practices that they can use to foster honorable approaches and relationships. So we've developed this ladder approach that has basically 3 dimensions. First of all, it's getting your own house in order through accurate record keeping, having the internal systems in place to be able to do the record keeping and the bookkeeping, and again, to have a good sense of where the money's coming from and how it's being spent. The second aspect is committing to transparency, not just having those sort of internal systems and controls, but also to be very forthright in terms of sharing and disclosing, again, where your money's coming from and how it's being spent. And then third is setting some standards. Maybe this is the hardest part, but for parties to be able to say, these are the lines that we won't cross, and these are the types of donors that we're not going to take money from. And just to give a specific example, taken actually from the US, where there were candidates in the 2020 primary elections that weren't satisfied, or they thought they needed to go farther than what the regulations required. So if you look at these 2 candidates from the Democratic primary, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, for instance, again, not satisfied with the state of play of political finance integrity in the US, they committed to no closed-door fundraisers to solicit high-dollar contributions, no money from corporate PACs or from super PACs or fossil fuel, drug, or insurance companies, and then built a campaign that really relied on small donations. And Bernie Sanders has kind of famously broke all sorts of records for fundraising. In fact, I think it was $46 million in 1 month, where the average donation was $21. So I think there are ways, again, that political parties can show that they're going to go above and beyond. Of course, the objective has to be more of a system-wide approach. So one last example I'll give is work that NDI did with Transparencia por Colombia, the TI chapter in Colombia, in a program called Cuentas Claras, where they started working with a few parties that wanted to, again, be transparent in terms of disclosing their finances. So they started with that sort of party-specific approach, but then it was adopted by the Election Commission as a system-wide sort of software and standardization process that now all parties and candidates have to comply with to disclose how they're spending their money and where their money is coming from. So again, parties don't have to wait. They can take the initiative, but hopefully that will create some healthy competition, some peer pressure, and the government, the election commissions, the legislatures can then standardize that across the system.
Thank you very much, Kristen, for outlining this. The political parties as part of the solution, not only the problem. And some of the elements on how to go about strengthening the integrity and the governance of political parties as key actors when we talk about democracy. If we move now to the second and final round of questions, in this round, I suggest we focus on a particular issue, which is the issue of influence or undue influence in democracies. First, I must stress that lobbying and influencing government is something that is actually essential, an essential element of democracy. So we are never referring to how to restrict this. On the contrary, what we want is more of the good influence, of the right ways of lobbying and influencing government. But of course, as we all know, there are risks to this. So in this round, we would like to discuss the impact of undue influence and what impact can that have actually on democratic values or democratic processes. So if I start with you, Minister Díaz, la Estrategia Nacional de Integridad y Prevención de la Corrupción de Costa Rica contempla el diseño e implementación de varias medidas para fortalecer la transparencia e integridad en el proceso de toma de decisión gubernamental. ¿Y cuál es entonces la estrategia de Costa Rica para abordar los riesgos o las preocupaciones relacionados a la influencia en el futuro cercano?
Sí, claro. Bueno, al iniciar el actual gobierno en mayo de este año, nosotros conocimos acerca de esa estrategia nacional que había sido liderada en su momento por la Procuraduría de la Ética Pública en conjunto con una organización que se llama Costa Rica Íntegra, que es el brazo de transparencia internacional en Costa Rica, y han venido trabajando en un grupo multisectorial que está conformado por el Poder Ejecutivo, el Poder Judicial, sector privado, academia, expertos en la materia y otros invitados que pueden llevarse en el momento dependiendo del aspecto puntual que se vaya a conocer. El pasado mes de julio, justamente se presentó el estudio de integridad de la OCDE acerca de nuestro país en Costa Rica, donde participó el presidente de la República, don Rodrigo Chávez Robles, y él ahí mismo reiteró su compromiso absoluto con el cumplimiento de esta estrategia nacional. Y es por eso que desde el gobierno se ha convocado a esta mesa que ha venido trabajando por varios meses y se le ha dicho desde el más alto nivel que se coordine a través del Ministerio de Justicia y el Ministerio de la Presidencia para justamente impulsar varias de las reformas que se han venido trabajando. Una de esas reformas que recientemente se presentó en nuestro Congreso el pasado 3 de noviembre es la reforma de ley para la protección de los denunciantes y evitar que se den represalias para quien denuncia actos de corrupción. Eso se está empezando a discutir también a lo interno de la Asamblea Legislativa de nuestro país y se ha venido trabajando también con reformas en materia anticorrupción del grupo de soborno que ve los temas de cohecho y las recomendaciones que ha hecho la OCDE al respecto, y en eso pues nos encontramos en este momento tratando de hacer avanzar esa legislación. Obviamente hay muchas recomendaciones que aún se encuentran pendientes, que también son parte de este estudio de integridad, como por ejemplo fortalecer la transparencia en la toma de decisiones gubernamental para poder también establecer los marcos de integridad y de transparencia para aquellos que brinden asesoría al gobierno, por ejemplo, o todo lo que es el marco jurídico relacionado con temas de cabildeo, tráfico de influencias, conflicto de interés y demás. La idea que nosotros tenemos y en lo que estamos trabajando desde el inicio del gobierno es en tener esa mesa, institucionalizarla, porque hoy está declarada de interés público y hay un decreto ejecutivo que tiene esta mesa como parte de los objetivos nacionales. Sin embargo, se ha hablado de la posibilidad de hacerlo o una ley o buscar otro mecanismo para que independientemente de los gobiernos, esa mesa continúe funcionando. Inclusive, dentro del estudio de la OCDE se habla de que tiene que existir una secretaría técnica que lidere este proceso, que en el caso de Costa Rica podría ser una Procuraduría de la Ética Pública. Eso es parte de lo que tendremos que definir en su momento, pero ya nos encontramos trabajando para impulsar todas estas reformas. Lo más importante también que hemos venido trabajando recientemente es que además de los actores iniciales de esta mesa multisectorial que se ha venido trabajando dentro de la estrategia, vamos también a incorporar autoridades de instituciones descentralizadas, eventualmente gobiernos locales, inclusive el mismo Congreso, ya sea a través de la presidencia del Congreso o específicamente la presidencia de comisiones relacionadas con los temas de seguridad y narcotráfico, de corrupción, para que también desde la Asamblea Legislativa puedan participar de este lugar de trabajo y poder entre todos implementar las reformas que requerimos. Pienso que es necesario ese acercamiento entre los poderes del Estado, porque si bien es cierto, entendemos que hay una separación importante de poderes, lo cierto es que tenemos que trabajar unidos para impulsar todas las reformas. Muchas veces en la Asamblea Legislativa no existe comunicación con el Poder Judicial, desde el Poder Ejecutivo no hay comunicación con el Poder Judicial, y a veces ellos tienen identificadas cuáles son las reformas o los problemas que están enfrentando en su momento. Quizás es un problema legal y lo que se requiere es ir al Congreso a reformar la norma. A veces no es un problema de ley, es un problema de falta de recursos. En otros momentos quizás el problema es de gestión administrativa. Entonces, si nosotros no conversamos entre nosotros y esta mesa está hecha para lograr estos objetivos, difícilmente lograremos los cambios que el país requiere. Yo quiero reiterar aquí el absoluto compromiso de nuestro país y desde la Presidencia de la República, es un mensaje que el mismo presidente me ha pedido por favor compartir con todos ustedes, que estamos comprometidos con el impulso de esta agenda, porque no hacerlo sería devastador y podríamos perder lo más preciado que tenemos todos nosotros. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Minister, and for sharing with us one of the perhaps also overlooked issues, which is how do we institutionalize integrity in terms of what are the institutions and the important institutions if we are talking about democracy. Ambassador Markel, the United States has one of the longest experiences addressing the risk of undue influence. So you can share with us about specific tools that the United States has and has used in the past, whether this is domestic or foreign. How have these tools like the Lobbying Disclosure Act or the Foreign Agents Registration Act, have provided more transparency on who's attempting to influence government. And as we look towards the growing challenge of foreign interference, and the United States is one of the few countries that has actually a tool in place to provide some level of transparency on this, how can the OECD support other governments in strengthening their resilience to this type of foreign threats?
So the real question is who actually gets to influence a government? And the presence of undue influence threatens the principle that every voice matters because it reduces the ability of ordinary people to be heard. Before I was ambassador, I served 8 years as the governor of the state of Delaware. And I really saw firsthand how important individual voices can be on a whole variety of topics, but especially when it came to young people as it related to the environment. And we got a number of important environmental reforms through, the kinds of reforms that they've been working on in our state for literally 3 decades. But when a bunch of middle school kids and high school kids decided to build a coalition to make their voices heard, there was no choice but for the elected representatives, the House and the Senate, to respond. And sometimes it can be very painful as an elected official to have these conversations with your constituents. Sometimes you'd rather not have them, but at the end of the day, we are all much better off for it. And so the flip side of that, the flip side of having every voice matter is the undue influence, whether it's from internal sources like lobbyists or external sources like malign foreign actors. Either way, they're problematic because they erode the basic trust that ordinary citizens have that their voice is being heard. So, as I mentioned when I was governor, I saw that lobbying can play a huge role in how laws are made and how our government is conducted, at least in the US. And this lobbying can serve as whether it's an individual voice or a collective voice of important constituencies, or it could be the voice of a foreign power that's trying to disguise their voice in an attempt to influence and to corrupt our political discourse and our system. So we had a member of our Supreme Court a century ago, Justice Brandeis, and what he said was sunlight is the best disinfectant. And that, which means that transparency is the best method to fight against undue influence. That was true then. We believe it continues to be true today. And so with that in mind, the US passed what Julio referred to, the Foreign Agent Registration Act, which shines a light on lobbying efforts so the public knows who is benefiting from the lobbying. And what it does is it requires the registration of foreign commercial entities who were lobbying for the benefit of a foreign power, and it requires the reporting of detailed information about their activities. And then that information is posted online, and it's available for journalists, it's available for researchers, it's available for citizens. We think that's really important, and it's been a powerful tool to punish bad actors who seek to influence our political system and to disguise the beneficiaries of their lobbying, because failure to follow the rules can lead to prosecution, and it can lead to jail time if they are convicted. Sometimes those who are guilty of these violations are also involved in illegal campaign donations, tax evasion, and money laundering. And often they are for autocrats or kleptocrats or just others who threaten our rule of law system. So to help governments in this area, the OECD can do what the OECD does best, which is to help governments collect and use the data, make the data available widely to inform citizens and policymakers. And so we also believe that the more countries that pass their own FARA-like laws will facilitate more and better information sharing amongst all of us and strengthen us.
Thank you, Ambassador, for what you've mentioned on this principle of that every voice matters, and perhaps even more so young voices. And the example you shared, and you also shared the example of what we call the FARA, which is the Foreign Agents Registration Act. which I would encourage all of you to look at it, because there's a lot of criticisms about registries in general when we're talking about transparency, but while it's true there are challenges about them, this is one example of how useful it is, and I would encourage you to look at it, and I'm sure you will find a lot of very, very interesting information. We have used it a lot at the OECD in the past. Moving on to Monsieur Migaud. Examinons une zone de risque spécifique d'influence undue, s'il vous plaît. Les portes tournantes entre les gouvernements et les secteurs publics, en France, ça s'appelle communément les pantouflages. Comment la haute autorité revêt-elle ces défis et comment assurez-vous la conformité? Et plus largement, sur la question de leur influence entre étrangers en France, quelles sont les grandes priorités pour répondre à cette problématique?
Oui, la question qui est posée de qui influence en fait la décision est une question essentielle pour pouvoir s'interroger sur les outils permettant de tracer justement celles et ceux qui cherchent à influencer. Alors ce n'est pas une activité illégitime, que l'on cherche à défendre ses intérêts peut tout à fait se concevoir. Encore faut-il le faire dans la transparence et que cette activité puisse être régulée. Alors, il y a plusieurs outils que la France s'est efforcée de mettre en place, qui peuvent mériter ici et là encore quelques compléments. Il y a le contrôle des mobilités, effectivement, du public vers le privé, mais également du privé vers le public. Et là, on peut avoir des stratégies, bien sûr, de la part de quelques groupes, d'influencer les responsables publics en proposant d'être présents dans les cabinets ministériels, d'où la nécessité, bien évidemment, de contrôler cela. Alors, il y a des procédures qui ont été mises en place en France et qui font partie des missions de la haute autorité, qui doit exprimer un avis sur des prénominations de gens qui viennent dans le privé pour exercer des fonctions dans les cabinets ministériels, au cabinet du président de la République ou sur un certain nombre de fonctions importantes dans l'État. Et la déclaration d'intérêt est aussi un outil utile pour justement prévenir d'influences indues. Sur la question du lobbying, la France s'est dotée en 2016 d'une loi qui s'efforce de définir d'abord ce qu'est la représentation d'intérêt et qui tente de réguler le lobbying à travers notamment la tenue obligatoire d'un registre des représentants d'intérêt que tient la haute autorité pour la transparence de la vie publique. Nous avons aujourd'hui 2500 représentants d'intérêt qui déclarent de l'ordre de 55 000 actions. Et ça se fait dans le cadre d'un registre transparent que tient et que met à jour la haute autorité. Alors il y a encore des imperfections et nous essayons justement de tenir compte d'expériences que peuvent avoir aussi d'autres pays. Je pense aux États-Unis, à l'Australie, le Canada, l'Union européenne aussi, qui ont mis en place, l'Irlande aussi, qui ont mis en place un certain nombre, le même type de répertoire, avec notamment l'obligation d'être inscrit sur le répertoire pour entrer en contact avec un responsable public, ce qui me paraît être une règle essentielle. En France, nous avons parfois un peu complexifié les choses, ce qui peut rendre le répertoire existant un peu moins pertinent que n'ont pu le souhaiter les législateurs quand ils ont mis en place la loi. Parce que y a une tendance que peut avoir l'administration à revenir à travers un certain nombre de dispositions d'application sur ce qu'ont voulu les législateurs. Donc il faut être très vigilant là-dessus et nous n'hésitons pas, en tout cas, à bien pointer les difficultés. Alors après, il y a le sujet. J'avoue que nous sommes en pleine réflexion à notre niveau là-dessus et nous souhaitons d'ailleurs y travailler avec vous au niveau de l'OCDE sur l'influence effectivement des pays étrangers qui peut prendre différentes formes et qu'il est très important de pouvoir identifier et de pouvoir également tracer. Alors ça n'est pas simple, parce que là, l'opacité est plutôt la règle, les gens n'avancent pas découverts, bon, ils passent souvent par des différentes structures, donc il est important de pouvoir les identifier, et là aussi de pouvoir essayer de tracer tout cela. Et une fois de plus, la transparence est un excellent outil pour justement essayer de bien comprendre les influences qui s'exercent et comment une décision publique peut être prise.
Thank you very much. I mean, I would rephrase what you just said, or repeat what you just said, which is the transparency of influence, and highlight I'm going to just translate into English, although it's not perfect, I think, but I like it, which is the control of mobility between the private sector and the public sector, which is something actually that we actually want more of that under this sunlight that was mentioned earlier. And there are, of course, imperfections, but I would also encourage you to follow the work of the High Authority, because it is quite advanced in the transparency, in this control of mobility, and many times we get requests from OECD countries or non-OECD countries about, for example, how do we control this mobility, and we actually point to the experience of the High Authority that I think is quite insightful for many countries. Now moving to Kristen, since we were talking also about foreign influence, one of the principal characteristics of foreign influence is this opacity, this actually lack of transparency. But what type of transparency measures would you recommend as an effective counterpoint to this covert foreign-sponsored influence, and in particular foreign political finance and foreign-sponsored information operations?
Thanks, Julio, for that question. So this is an issue that we've been looking at for a while now, and we've done some research with Transparency International and with the Open Government Partnership, OGP, where we've looked at 3 forms of foreign-sponsored corruption: opaque debt, covert political finance, and information manipulation. So first of all, not surprisingly, they're all interrelated, right? These are forms of foreign-sponsored corruption that often work in cahoots, where an autocratic government can use information manipulation to tilt another country's election to favor the candidate that's going to promote their interest, or can use information manipulation, for instance, to promote a corrupt loan or extractive deal. So while these tactics and the relationships vary, as others have said, the through line is opacity. Foreign-sponsored schemes, because they're aimed at subverting a country's democratic process and policymaking, they're unpopular and they're often illegal. So knowing this, the autocratic actors take great care to shield their activities from public scrutiny, from parliamentary scrutiny, by using confidentiality clauses or shell companies or proxy donors. As others have said as well, and I agree, transparency it's a gateway reform. It's sort of the best initial defense against this form of undue influence. It helps to remove that shield or that cloak. And in the policy briefs that we've produced, we have kind of a menu of transparency options for each of those 3 forms of foreign-sponsored corruption. Since we've already heard this morning about information manipulation, and I already talked a little bit about political finance corruption, I'm going to use my soapbox here to evangelize a little bit on the topic of debt transparency, actually, because opaque debt is a problem. It's more a feature than a bug in the system. Loans are often given without parliamentary scrutiny, without public information, without the existence of a loan being disclosed at all. And for instance, the World Bank said 40% of low-income developing countries have neglected to publish any sovereign debt data over the last 2 years. And what situation are we in? We're in a situation right now of acute debt distress around the world that fundamentally affects the development trajectories of countries. As I'm sure a lot of you know, the poorest countries in the world, 21 of 25 countries in the world, currently are paying more in debt service payments than in healthcare, education, and social services combined. So we're in this situation where irresponsible, unsustainable debt, in large part because it's been opaque and not subject to scrutiny, has contributed to a debt crisis that's now undermining our COVID recovery around the world, not to mention the integrity challenges. Of course, we have cases like Mozambique, where $2 billion of debt were taken out in secret. We have other cases where official lending from China in particular just standardizes confidentiality clauses. It can't be disclosed to other lenders or to the public, and it also often involves the collateralization of strategic reserves. If the country doesn't pay it back, it can lose a port or an airport or some other strategic asset. So I think I'm also mentioning this because this is a solvable problem. A lot of these democracy challenges we're talking about are really intractable, whereas I think this one has a much more simple solution, that if you're a borrower country, you need minimally to publish what you borrow. And if you're a lender country or a bank or an IFI, you need to publish what you're lending. And that needs to be established, I think, and applied consistently as a global integrity and democracy norm. And I want to give a shout out. The OECD does have a debt transparency platform that seems perfectly functional. The problem has been a lack of political will in its application and in banks disclosing through that debt transparency platform. Again, the solutions are there, but I think it's up to OECD countries, other borrower and lender countries, the IFIs and the banks to, again, consistently apply this norm to help, again, build resilience against corruption through opaque lending and foreign influence through opaque lending.
Thank you, Kirsten. So, yeah, the three ways I would say is the information manipulation, political finance from abroad, and not new, but perhaps highlighting it more, the opaque debt, which I would add that there is an interesting research done by the IMF on this point on what we call the new lenders, which are not very transparent about what, to whom and how much they are lending, and the integrity risks and democracy risks that they create. And Hannah, also perhaps continuing on this point of foreign influence, the New Zealand government has prepared actually guidance for public officials on how to identify when they are subject to what is called foreign interference attempts. Can you elaborate a little bit on this guidance? I think the audience here and the virtual audience would find it interesting, and what good practice other governments can draw for raising awareness for all public officials.
Thank you for the question. Before I answer directly that question, I would like to give a little bit of context of Cardiff, New Zealand, and I'm loving these metaphors. I'm thinking about now the birds flying information into the sunlight. So in New Zealand, we, in terms of this question of undue influence in the domestic policy process, I think we have a high level of confidence that there is not a significant issue. We have a high degree of transparency. Our ministers publish their diaries. It's routine for all submissions to any government policy process to be published, and the final advice is published, and submissions to Parliament are published. So I think for us in a domestic setting, as I say, there's a high degree of confidence. There is one issue, just to link to another topic that is the subject for this forum, which is really thinking about the potential unconscious bias in those systems and how that links to how we promote public participation in government processes. So this is something that we are emphasizing a need for our public service to be better at. And in order to do that, we are encouraging the use of, we have a policy community engagement tool. And what that really does is ask government departments to be really explicit about the choices they're making about the degree of engagement in different settings. It's not always possible. There are other barriers, the political context, resource constraints. So really this tool is about being really upfront and honest about how much engagement and consultation is going to happen. But within that tool, it does ask people to think about all of the stakeholders who may have an interest in that topic and to explicitly describe that. And so I think that has a really key role in addressing that unconscious bias and really considering those voices that may be excluded or who may be disproportionately listened compared to others. So when you come to then the question of foreign influence, in this context of relatively high trust, kind of confidence that our processes are working well, it's almost a bit of a shift for our people to think about the threat that is there in terms of foreign interference. I mean, we know that we need a comprehensive strategy. The nature of these threats have changed considerably given geopolitical changes, given emerging digital technologies. And so the first step that we take is to be really clear about how we're organizing ourselves within government, establishing a leadership voice who can give guidance to others across government. And one of their key roles is to analyze those threats and to share information, because we actually need to convince people that this is a real issue, that it's something to be taken seriously. And that's going to be essential if we're going to have people reporting suspicious information. But then also to come to the guidance that you mentioned, what we can do in a proactive sense is to think about the protections that we can put in place. So what we have is a framework for protective security requirements that cover a whole range of different elements of security, and they ask government agencies to work through that framework. It gives them a sense of what is really critical and that they need to have mandatory steps on, but it also enables them to work through in a flexible way that's appropriate to their organization and think about the maturity of how they might learn over time and to share experiences of what's good practice and to go and seek help from our system leader who gives them that advice and support.
Thanks very much, Hannah, for sharing this, I would say, the other approach or the complementary approach, in addition to transparency, the support that can be given to public servants and actually show that this is a real issue. More and more, we see it in more and more countries. So Delia, the last question for the panelists, perhaps bringing everything back to you. How can we then ensure that we have more of the good influence and less of the bad influence, if we can oversimplify it like this? And what can governments do, but also what can business do to engage and influence responsibly?
Thank you very much, Julio. I promise to be very short because we all want to go to have lunch. And the message has been passed. Transparency International is 30 years old. 30 years ago, in a panel like this, nobody would have started by saying transparency is the answer. And transparency is a coin of two sides. It's information, but it's also integrity. So thank you very much. We are in the right way, working together, civil society organization, governments, and the private sector. In this, there has been a long way. What we need really is action, not only commitments, not only signing declarations, or even passing law. We have to transform these rules into reality, in the way in which business is conducted. So I ask everybody to work against the corruption cycle that I call SHE: steal, hide, enjoy. And we have to cut this cycle. And in this moment, we need governments to be very active, establishing beneficial ownership transparency, central registers with updated information and accessible to the public. We need governments to fight against enablers of corruption, those who help to hide the stolen money. And for this, the importance of strong democracies and the northern countries is quite significant. The money that is lost to corruption in Africa or in Latin America ends in the city of London, in the real estate in New York, in the luxury industry in France, or in the antiques and art market in Geneva. And there are gatekeepers that are not doing the gatekeepers' jobs, but facilitating. In this sense, I wish that the Senate approved the Gatekeepers Act that is being discussed in the US at this moment. But the problem we are facing now is the undue influence from new actors. It's not the business sector trying to hide what they are doing in terms of influence the government. It's the organized crime, the corrosive capitals, the foreign actors acting through what is called the influence industry. A colleague organization, Tactical Tech, has started collecting these companies that sell influence. We were aware of Cambridge Analytica because of the scandal, but there are lots of them working from outside, working for abroad, absolutely opaque. So this organization is or has created the Influence Industry Reporter, looking for these organizations, saying where they are working, for whom they are working. And of course, these organizations will not go to any of the registers that we have created. For many years, we have developed together lots of tools, very important ones. We have to keep on renewing and updating them. But we have to start thinking for these new actors that will not register, that will not operate even from the country, that are not foreign agents in the legal term. And for that, we are facing two special problems. Domestic regulation is not enough to stop this influence. For instance, if you, from X country, pay an influencer just to say something to his or her community and pay for that in a campaign election, how is the regulation of a country tackle that? It's almost impossible. And also we have the speed of these messages going through. So these actors are not within the reach of domestic regulation. So the work of OECD is very important in this realm. You can collaborate in order to create the standards or help countries to coordinate the work, sharing information, for instance. The second point, how are we going to enforce these regulations? Even if we get the regulation from OECD or the standards, whatever it is, we have just published our report, Exporting Corruption, in order to measure how the OECD Convention against foreign bribery. And I must say that the majority of the countries to the convention have a very weak activity enforcing the convention. And it is a very old, well-established convention. So we need regulation, but we also need multilateral collaboration for the enforcement, not designed according to what we have now for MLA, the multilateral collaboration, which is designed on the legal structure of the 19th century. So the judge asks a question, goes to the foreign ministry to send that to the other country to the judge that or the court that has to answer the question say, there is a detail missing here, so we have to go back. In the meantime, money and influence is moving in our world at the velocity of a click in a computer or a click in our telephones. So we have to react to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Delia, very much for the last words. Before closing, I would just like to give the floor for a brief intervention from Gloria de la Fuente, who's the chair of the OECD Working Party of Senior Public Integrity Officials. Gloria, please.
Thank you a lot, because all of ours is so tired. I think it's so we want to coffee. Okay, here. That is okay. Well, my name is Gloria de la Fuente. I'm a chair of the OECD Working Party of Senior Public Integrity Officials, SPO, and it's my pleasure to be here and today and listen of this interesting and your experience about this important situation. As chair of SPIO, and I want to share briefly of how OECD is supporting democracies and strengthening political integrity and counter foreign interference. As one mentioned early, our working party is a responsibility to two of the main standards of discussed today: the OECD recommendation on public integrity and OECD recommendation on principles for transparency and integrity lobbying. Both recommendations provide an essential foundation of the carrying out work on political integrity and undue foreign influence. On political integrity, the SPIO is commitment to supporting countries to raise standards on political integrity for elected and appointed officials. Through our country's review, we provide concrete recommendations based on good practices to address issues on lobbying, conflict interest, the revolving door, and the political finance. All of these things you are talking about that. The work on political integrity for the SPIO will be organizing two expert groups, one of government officials responsible for oversight elements for political integrity, ethics commissioners, political financial bodies, lobbying commissioner, etc., and one of like-minded elected and appointment officials who are commitment to strengthen integrity standards. An essential focus of these experts groups will be to develop guidance for government on strengthening political integrity. Concerning the issues of foreign interference, I am proud of work of the SPO has done to date, in particular through the 2021 monitoring report on the 2010 lobbying recommendation. We highlighted that there is a very little transparency of foreign government lobbying. For FINIT, therefore, to the SPO is seeking to support OECD members to strengthen their frameworks on foreign influence. An essential tool is our recent draft recommendation on transparency and integrity lobbying, which is now open for public consultation. That recommendation includes guidance for countries strengthening their transparency and integrity frameworks, not only on domestic lobbying and influence, but also on lobbying influence activities from foreign government and foreign commercial interest. The SPO is a full agenda ahead of this, and we are confident this work, the OECD members and non-members reinforcing to democracy. Thanks for this space, Julia, and thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you very much, Gloria. I mean, I have nothing to add. I think everything has been said by our speakers. Let me just thank you again. We missed already two speakers. I had to catch a train, but join me, please, in thanking the speakers with a warm applause for you.
Thank you very much, Julio, Gloria, and the panelists for your insights on how to combat corruption, preserve integrity, and fight undue influence that are so key to democracies. I'd like to end this morning's plenary sessions, with one quote, because I think we've addressed all these issues in the quote, and we will continue in the afternoon session. And the quote is by Abraham Lincoln, and is as follows: "Democracy is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people." And I think we've addressed each bit of this quote this morning and continue this afternoon. So I'm sure you're all striving for lunch, so I'm going to invite you to now go for lunch and move to the lunch break. The buffet is outside, as I told you this morning, and you're all invited. After lunch, we'll be meeting in smaller groups and parallel sessions, and the first set of sessions, because we are so late, we'll gather at 2:15, so we're 14:15. We will meet in different rooms. The rooms are notified outside on signposts. If you're lost, I'm sure somebody will be ready to accompany you and help you find your room. So don't hesitate to ask the staff members. So all I can say now is bon appétit and see you later.
Thank you.